So it goes and creates a directory structure, which is what we're going to look at now. Because you've all used Composer, this kind of structure will be relatively familiar to you. But if there was anyone in the room who has spent most of their time on something like WordPress, this structure would be quite alien. Okay? So let's look at it. I'm not going to go through every folder it creates. I'm just going to pull out some highlights. There's a config folder, and that's where you set up your routes, you describe your pipelines to Zend Expressive, and you put your own config files as well. They all go in there. There's a data folder. Taking all these config files and loading them at runtime and merging them into one cohesive data structure obviously takes time. It's relatively fast, but there's the ability to cache that config if you're on a production server where the config doesn't change from request to request, for example. And the cache lives inside the data folder. Then there's the public folder where all your static assets go, which for an API, you don't really have them, to be honest, if you're doing an API service. But in something like WordPress, everything effectively lives in that because that's the web server's document route, or the doc route for short. Obviously with this structure, all the code is moved above the doc route so people can't call arbitrary pieces of PHP directly. They've all got to go through the router to get to it, which is it's a level of security. You've got the source folder, which is where we're going to put all our code, our modules and everything. There's a top-level test folder. Zend Expressive separates all the testing code separately out from your source code, so that when you tarball all this up and ship it, you can just drop that test folder entirely. I believe Symfony tests can appear in multiple places, including next to the code that's actually being tested. It's not always separated out to a large degree. There's no top-level test folder you could absolutely drop and be sure you got rid of all the tests, for example, from what I've seen. I'm not sure in this day and age anyone cares because that test code can't be executed accidentally. People just tend to ship it anyway because they just tarball the whole thing. And then there's the vendor folder, which is what Composer looks after for you. It's all standard stuff there. So if you use Composer, you'll know about auto-loading. It's one of the nice things about Composer. And PSR4 is what Zend Expressive uses. You may have used PSR0 as well, the older one where you had the whole namespace as folder structure on disk. So Zend Expressive prefers PSR4. So if we take our structure and we look inside our source folder, the first thing we get is an app folder. This is under source. And that's created by the installer. And that's the first module. And it gives you a skeleton module so you can see how to do things. And the source code actually lives inside a nested source folder inside app inside source. That's what it does. And it's that nested source folder that the PSR4 namespace points at. In composer.json, the autoload section looks like that. Okay? That's what it does by default. Of course, you can go in there and change it. You can do whatever you want. But that's what it does by default. So inside this source folder, that's where the actual namespaced code goes, just as you're used to. And there's a special file called config provider. And that it's a class with methods on it, and it provides information to Zend Expressive about your module. At the minute, it's just DI container and information about any templates you're using. Maybe they'll expand that in future so modules can have their own routes, I don't know. But that's how it is today. And that's the file, as you create modules, you'll be editing a lot. And the reason there's a nested source folder is because if you're using any templates, they go in their own subfolder as well. So it's a structure designed for growth without changing anything. So although it looks a little redundant at first, in 5 years' time, who knows what else is going to appear in that second top level alongside that source folder. So it's created space for the future, and I'm a big fan of that. Now, I'm sorry, Matthew, I hate the fact you call the default module app. It's crap, and it's also not compliant with the PSR standards. They say you shouldn't be polluting the top-level namespace like this. You should actually be using vendor as the top-level namespace, which in my case is Ganbaro Digital. And then it should be your app name under there. So for example, if I was building a billing API, and then your module name should be the third one down. And it would be nice if Zend Expressive did something like this out the box, and it doesn't. So that's something I go through, and I go through and change all that. So I'll take that app folder, and I call it core. as my default folder because I need a dumping ground. When I'm building a new app, I don't know what modules I want. I can't always design everything up front. Sometimes you have to explore it and iterate. And so I want somewhere to put all my code until I'm confident if this really needs to be in a separate module. So that's what I use core for. I use it as a dumping ground. And then the next thing I do with this code structure is I dump in some additional modules to give us some business logic. Sorry, to support the business logic. I don't use an ORM at all. I handle databases in a very different way. So I will normally have that abstracted out into some sort of storage module that the other modules can call. My APIs tend to run on cloud infrastructure with load balancers and auto scaling. Those load balancers want to talk to your app to find out if your app is happy or not, to know whether it needs to send it traffic or whether it needs to kill off that instance of the app and spin up a new one. So it's helpful if you build in APIs for health checks as well to support your load balancers. And then we start dumping in other modules for individual business areas. And you just put them in as and when you feel the need. Now for me, for a guiding principle, I try to design my API paths so at some point they go off to their own module. That's what I try to do because I'm after this isolation. I don't want one API path to be split across 3 or 4 modules because I don't want change to start breaking things unexpectedly. I want to keep it nice and focused and nice and isolated, and also makes it easier to reason about as well. So if I had 2 API paths like this, at some point they would drop into their own modules to be handled. So you could have a lot more off the end of these API strings, for example, these query paths. So that's what the code looks like. And that's a structure that works for me. But one of the nice things about Zend Expressive is it doesn't care. You could change that structure however you wanted. That structure is not baked in because ultimately, in order to load these modules, there's a config file that Zend Expressive calls that in turn loads all those config provider files. It instantiates each of those config providers to get the config out, and the config tells it where everything else is, you see. So you can change the structure to whatever suits you. This is just what works for me. Any questions about the code layout? What do you think about it? Look relatively straightforward, relatively logical? So, I mean, I've got a code base that's 2 years old now using Zend Expressive. I think it's been through 2 upgrades already, and it's still on Zend Expressive 2, so it's got to be upgraded to Zend Expressive 3, which came out recently. And in all that time, I have not changed this structure once. I may have changed how my app is behaving and moved things around from one module to another to improve isolation, but that's on me. That's nothing to do with Zend Expressive. I'm very pleased with the level of stability in my layout that Zend Expressive has given me. Any layout problems are mine, they're not the framework's at all. I'm very happy with that.